Good evening. Allow me to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we gather today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Good evening, all. Welcome to tonight's seminar by Professor Alexander Kitroeff on AHEPA, 100 Years Between Americanism and Hellenism. But before we proceed with this seminar, allow me to go through some housekeeping items. For the month of June, all our seminars will be online with international speakers, so please watch out for those email notifications that contain the Facebook and YouTube links to join. Next week's seminar will be by Paris-based Dr. Georgios Daciopoulos, who'll be speaking on the Greek diaspora in France. Another event taking place this Sunday at 12 noon is a Trisaio, a memorial event at St. Demetrios Church in High Street, Paran, to commemorate the passing away of our teacher, Alexandros Yanadakis. Alexandros passed away suddenly last Tuesday. He was the coordinator of the Greek Community of Melbourne's Classical Greek and Modern Greek for adult programs. A kind-hearted and gifted man who for almost 2 decades offered his educational services to the Greek diaspora in Australia. He will be sorely missed by everyone, his students, teachers, parents, and friends. Now let's return to tonight's seminar, AHEPA, 100 Years Between Americanism and Hellenism. Founded in 1922, AHEPA, the acronym for the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, is the largest Greek American institution, second only to the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. Outside the US, it also has chapters in Canada, Greece, Cyprus, Australia, and New Zealand. In fact, the Australian chapter was founded in 1934, so its centennial anniversary isn't far away. As a fraternal organization, it was founded on July 26, 1922 in Atlanta, Georgia. It was founded with a focus on civil rights, particularly to counteract the activities of the Ku Klux Klan. It was established to combat the racism and xenophobia that Greeks encountered in America in the 1910s and early 1920s, but also to encourage Greeks to Americanize and assimilate as a way of protecting themselves. As Greek migrants slowly but steadily became accepted into America's mainstream, AHEPA over time has repivoted its focus to focus more on Hellenism and its promotion. It describes its mission goals as to promote the ancient Hellenic ideals of education, philanthropy, civic responsibility, family, individual excellence through community service and volunteerism. The presentation today will examine AHEPA's 100-year history and explain why and how it adapted so well to the changing American landscape and Greek America's identity. And to give this presentation today, we welcome back Professor Alexander Kitroeff. He's no stranger to the seminar series. He was born in Athens and was educated in the UK, where he obtained his PhD in modern history from the University of Oxford. He has published extensively and continues to do so on Greeks of the diaspora. His most recent books are The Greeks in the Making of Modern Egypt in 2019, Greek Orthodoxy in America, A Modern History, and also more recently the history of AHEPA as well. During the course of presentation, there will be some sort of codes as well to purchase the book if you're sort of interested. When he's not teaching or researching, he's following the green bandwagon, Prasinos. And by that, I don't mean he's a follower of PASOK or the Greens politically, although he might harbor such sympathies, I don't know, but a follower of the sports club Panathinaikos. Professor Kitroeff, please take it away.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Nick. Thank you to the community in Melbourne. It's great to be back in this really wonderful seminar series. A lot of organizations started seminar series during COVID, and then they kind of let them lapse. But I'm really glad that the Melbourne community is continuing this really wonderful idea, and this Zoom helps bring the Greek diaspora together, and that's a very, very important thing. Yes, great win by Panathinaikos yesterday at the basketball. I should acknowledge that, and looking forward to the deciding Game 5 in Athens tomorrow. What I want to what I'm talking to you, my topic today is AHEPA's 100 years from 1922 to 2022. And basically, there is one theme, a thread that runs through AHEPA's history, as far as I have discovered in my research. And that is AHEPA's ability to adapt both to the changing circumstances in the United States, but also the changes that the Greek American community is experiencing. As you know, the Greeks arrived in America in the early part of the 20th century, from the turn of the century to about the 1920s. There were about 350,000 Greeks in America at that time. Subsequently, there were limits to immigration, but there was a new influx of maybe up to 150,000. That might be a little bit too much, but 150,000 in the post-war period. So the Greek American community is diverse, and we now have third, fourth, even fifth generation Greek Americans. And to have an organization sustain itself with membership which is basically of Greek origin, of Greek Americans born in the United States, is a challenge, especially when you talk about second and third generation. And I think, AHEPA's huge success is that it's adapted sufficiently to be able to maintain itself. It's got about a 20,000 membership, 25,000, and continues to do so. It was founded, as Nick said, in 1922 to combat racism and xenophobia and to promote Americanization of the Greek immigrants, basically to protect it. Its idea was that the Greek immigrants can protect themselves from xenophobia and racism by persuading the American establishment and all Americans that they would become loyal American citizens, they would integrate into the society, and thus undermine any suspicion that they were hostile outsiders. Very significantly, AHEPA is established in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta is where the Ku Klux Klan was reinvented. The Ku Klux Klan was established back in the 19th century, and by the turn of the century, its activities had died down somewhat, but then the influx of immigrants from Southeastern Europe, including Greeks, regenerated the organization, and it was actually established again formally in Atlanta in 1915. So in a sense, it makes sense that the founders of AHEPA, these 8 Greek American businessmen in Atlanta, decided to form the organization to counter what Ku Klux Klan was all about. AHEPA had many aspects to its promotion of Americanism. Maybe the most controversial was the use of English. It insisted that English was used in its conventions and in its chapter meetings. And that, of course, was a challenge for some people because some Greeks, even Greek businessmen, had not a good grasp of English. And in the end, by the end of the 1920s, AHEPA reconciled itself to the use of English and Greek. But language, it's significant that they had an issue over language, and language continues to be an issue for the Greek American community. It's a marker. If you speak Greek, you are expressing certain things. If you're speaking English, you are expressing more of an Americanism. The visits of the White House were very, very important. Here you see on the left there with President Roosevelt, who is wearing the peculiar fez that AHEPA used at the time. The fezes were part of what Masonic organizations used in the United States. And AHEPA's adoption of a Masonic structure was part of the plan to persuade Americans that this was a kind of American-oriented organization, because middle-class Americans tended to go into these Masonic organizations. So by becoming by adopting a Masonic structure, that AHEPA believed it would reassure Americans. On the right, it's with President in the 1920s, Coolidge. President Coolidge as well was one of these presidents in the 1920s who was pro-immigrant. He believed that America could find ways of integrating the incoming Southeast European immigrants, and he was very glad to receive AHEPA. So those were very important things. Obviously, Roosevelt is the 1930s, Coolidge in the 1920s. So AHEPA is kind of declaring its Americanism in very, very symbolic ways. The other way was a more practical way, and that was encouraging Greeks to acquire US citizenship. And they had a huge success. The figures are difficult to figure out, but it's almost 1 in 4. And there's about 75,000 Greeks who acquire US citizenship between 1923 and 1939. There are about 275,000 Greek-born. So it's about 1 in 4. And this doesn't count the Greeks who came in from the Ottoman Empire, who may not have had Greek citizenship, so were not counted in the statistics. They also were taking up American citizenship. So this is a very important moment in the history of Greek America, a very important moment in the history of AHEPA, because it's a hugely successful move that is reflected throughout the country. Greeks all over the United States are acquiring US citizenship. The problem with doing that is, of course, that you can become a victim of your own success, as it were. Because if your raison d'etre, if your reason to exist is getting Greeks to Americanize, and the Greeks are Americanizing, then you may be almost, write yourself out of the history. You're becoming redundant. But AHEPA had 2 other ways in which it was connecting to Greece. I think I skipped a slide. Yes. So it did promote Hellenism, now as well as Americanism. That's hence the topic of today is AHEPA's balance between Americanism and Hellenism. Now, the Hellenism they promoted in the 1920s was, of course, a ancient Greek Hellenism, talking about the Hellenic genius, the significance of ancient American culture for the founders of the American Republic. It was very much an effort to say, hey, we are the descendants of the ancient Greeks whom you revere and you consider as the cornerstone of Western civilization. So in a sense, it was a bid to become accepted by invoking the continuity of Hellenism. And that was very important. And the Greek Americans continued to invoke the continuity between modern Greece and ancient Greece. They do it throughout their history. It was very, very pronounced with AHEPA in the 1920s and 1930s and continues to be so. Now, the more public aspect of Hellenism for AHEPA was this invocation of ancient Greece. But there was also a connection with Greece itself, with Greek Orthodoxy and Greece. Now, when I was researching and writing this 100-year history of AHEPA, from what I knew from reading whatever existed about AHEPA, I it wasn't clear that they were connected too much with Greek Orthodoxy, because officially they played Greek Orthodoxy down and just presented themselves as a Christian organization. And I wasn't too clear about their connections with Greece. But looking at their archives, I saw, first of all, there was a strong indirect connection with Orthodoxy. First of all, this is on the left, you see this. This is the Greek Orthodox Church in Atlanta, where the AHEPA founders meet in order to establish their organization. And they continue to be connected with Greek Orthodoxy, even though they may not be promoting it publicly, continuously, at least in the 1920s and 1930s. And if you look on the kind of ground, on the grassroots level, there are many, many leading AHEPans who are very important members of their parishes. So there is a sort of subterranean connection between AHEPA and Orthodoxy, and that is going to become more and more obvious in the decades that follow. The other thing is this wonderful custom of annual excursions to Greece, which of course were done with by a ship, and the first one was in 1928, and they continued annual visits right through till World War II, and then they kind of continue them a little bit with in the 1950s, but then the travel, of course, is replaced by aeroplane, and formal excursions cease to become the characteristic of AHEPA, but those were very important visits. They came to Athens, they laid a wreath at the unknown soldier on Syntagma Square, and then they went off and visited their villages, and many people, many AHEPans made very many important philanthropic contributions. So they had this connection with Greek Orthodoxy in Greece. I'm stressing this connection because until I did my research, the idea was that AHEPA was this Americanizing organization, typical Americanakia was the stereotype, and that wasn't the case. AHEPA was it promoted its Americanism, but had a very important Hellenic connection, and that for me is let's say, the most typical thing of the Greek diaspora. I think the Greek in the diaspora adapts, integrates, assimilates, but they also keep their Greek language, their Greek heritage, their Greek roots. They manage both, I think, much better and more impressively than other ethnic groups. AHEPA's Hellenic connection became very useful during World War II. During World War II, the Greek American community rallied to Greece's side, both during when it was fighting the Italians and when Greece fell under occupation, by sending supplies, clothes, foodstuffs for the famine, medical supplies. There was a number of ways in which the Greek Americans were helping, and they formed something called the Greek War Relief Association, which was formed with Spiros Skouras, the president of 20th Century Fox in Hollywood, as the president, and it was done with the support of the then Archbishop Athinagoras, who then became Ecumenical Patriarch. What is not known in the history of the Greek War Relief Association is that the Greek War Relief Association basically had some committees in the major towns in the United States, but the work itself was done by AHEPA chapters, by parishes and AHEPA chapters. And in fact, there's a convention in AHEPA in the 1940s, and some people complain that, hey, the Greek American War Relief Association is getting all the publicity and we are not. And the AHEPA leadership responds that this is the best way to go forward, and AHEPA's role will be recognized. It wasn't quite recognized as much as it could have. But from the World War II onwards, we have a big turning point in which AHEPA becomes much more active. A very important turning point for the history of the Greeks in America writ large is, of course, the declaration of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, when Truman makes the decision to give military aid to Greece, to the Greek government, of course, to fight during the Greek Civil War, when, of course, we have the insurgency of the left and the Democratic Army fighting in the north of Greece. So it's the beginning of very heavy and critical US involvement in Greece. And this helps an organization like AHEPA, which is balancing between Americanism and Hellenism. Now, in a sense, if the US is Greece's official and the Greek government's closest ally, then in a sense, there's a political context which in fact makes AHEPA's attempt to combine the both even more relevant. And from then on, AHEPA becomes more assertive in its policies. And the first thing it becomes assertive over is the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. Now, this is the first act which the United States, the United States has limited emigration from Southeastern Europe. But because of the situation, the devastation of World War II, it will take a series of steps to allow displaced persons and refugees from those countries to enter the United States. It's not easy. There's opposition in Congress. The Displaced Persons Act was very, very limited. And when Truman approved it, he actually attached a text to his signature saying it was very restrictive, and he hoped there would be subsequent acts opening up the doors of America even wider. And indeed, they were in the 1950s. That's what gives us the rising number of Greeks. There's about 75,000 Greeks that come in until the 1960s, and then the doors open more officially, and we have another 75,000. Seeing that Truman was opposed to the Displaced Persons Act publicly gave AHEPA the courage. It opened the door for AHEPA to start agitating and making statements and going to Congress and making declarations to the effect that the Greeks were law-abiding citizenship and more of them should be allowed to enter Greece. And this is the first step of AHEPA having a presence in Washington. I don't want to use the word lobbying because there's an officially AHEPA is not a lobbying organization, so maybe I'll say lobbying small l and not officially lobbying, but putting pressure on Capitol Hill, on Congress and the White House through expressing views of its members. AHEPA starts with the issue of refugees, goes on to Cyprus in the 1950s, and will continue to do so. There are certain overreaches by AHEPA, and one of the ones that has recently come to light through the research of Professor Gonda van Steen is the very unfortunate situation with the adopted children from Greece, because part of letting Greek displaced people and refugees in was asking the US government to approve the adoptions by either Greek American or American couples of children in Greece. It started in the 1950s, and it eventually became an illegal practice. It became a business. There were many adoptions which were not correctly done in Greece due to the way that the Greek authorities were working. And AHEPA officially stopped its involvement in 1956 because of the problematic nature of the adoptions. But two AHEPA members continued to do so. One of them was Leo Lamberson, who is seen here. He on his own with another AHEPA member continued the practice of doing adoptions until Greece, until more scandals were uncovered in Greece in the early 60s, and the practice was put under very strict control. So this was one moment in which AHEPA's overenthusiasm to bring adopted children, in the end, AHEPA was in over its head. It's a very delicate situation, this adoption of children, and thankfully it was stopped in the 1950s, and more relevant agencies took over. Greece, in the 1960s, continued to be a close American ally, and AHEPA is looking again for a raison d'etre, a reason to exist, and it becomes very involved with Greece. It becomes very Hellenic oriented, but from an American point of view. In other words, what the AHEPA does is to try and become a bridge between the US and Greece. And in 1963, it establishes the Truman statue in Athens. This is from the uncovering of the statue, which is on Vasileos Konstantinou, just below the Hilton and near the old Olympic Stadium in Athens. Again, it was an occasion in which US-Greek ties were celebrated, but I should note that right at the same time, what was happening with just a few days difference from the uncovering of the statue was the funeral of Grigoris Labrakis, the left-wing deputy who was killed in Thessaloniki and was the subject of Costa Gavras's well-known film Z, and Labrakis had been attacked and killed in Thessaloniki. His funeral was taking place the same days, and this for me is an unfortunate coincidence, but it shows that how AHEPA is very much identified with official conservative politics, right-wing Greece, rather than and incurs some sort of suspicion and hostility on the part of the many other Greeks, which will be deepened during the dictatorship of 1967-1974, when AHEPA mindlessly will support the regime. In 1965, it's very significant, they have their first convention in Greece, and they have it, of course, at the Hilton, the American Hilton, which has just been built, which is a symbol of the American presence and modernism in Greece. And they continue their connection with Greece and appear to support, or at least, support, I think, would be the easiest way to describe it, the colonel's dictatorship, which is established in 1967. And in 1970, only 5 years after the 1965 convention, they come back to Greece and they have their Supreme Convention, and they receive red carpet treatment, of course, by the regime that is so happy to have them. It's another way that it legitimizes itself. This is a Greek post office stamp issued especially for the occasion. It's very difficult to find photographs of that particular convention that took place in 1970. It should be said that in 1973, AHEPA President Michael Spirtos travels to Athens, meets people who are critical of the regime, goes back to the United States, and in the 1973 convention of AHEPA, communicates to the membership that the regime is corrupt, that there is great dissent in Athens, and suggests that AHEPA should distance itself. There's a huge reaction on the part of the rank and file who are conservative, and there's a kind of statement made which is kind of a lukewarm statement in between, but it's the first time that AHEPA does express some criticism against the colonel's regime, which will collapse, of course, in 1974. You could argue too little, too late, but it's important to acknowledge at least those members of AHEPA who tried to make a statement against the regime. The following year is another turning point for AHEPA because of the invasion of the attempted coup, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, and the occupation of the northern part of Cyprus. And all those events culminate in August. And it's about August 19, I think, AHEPA is holding its convention in Boston, which is one of the main cities in which there's a huge Greek-American presence. August 18th was the opening day. And suddenly AHEPA, in a sense, puts behind it forgets about its support of the regime and the colonels. It invites Greek-American congressmen and comes up with very forceful statements in support of Cyprus, in support of the Greek cause, a critique of Kissinger, and an appeal to the US Congress to sanction Turkey's actions by establishing the so-called Turkish arms embargo, which was something that the Greek-American lobby, which AHEPA was participating in, although it doesn't officially lobby. The embargo was established in 1975 and remained in place until Carter lifted it in 1978. But a huge success for AHEPA, a huge success for the Greek-American lobby. And from now on, AHEPA maintains an almost permanent presence of meeting with congressmen in Capitol Hill, expressing the views of the Greek Americans, going to meetings at the White House, and going to meetings more recently at the State Department. There's a range of activities AHEPA is doing even after the embargo is over in 1978. This was one of the many full-page advertisements that AHEPA took out in 1974 as part of the Greek-American mobilization. This happens to be from the Washington Post. They put those full-page ads in all the major American newspapers. United States must stop illegal aid to Turkey now. After the end of the embargo, despite their presence in Washington, AHEPA is in one of these moments in its history when it's kind of looking for causes to take up. So as we shall see, it's involved in many philanthropic organizations domestically. It's still supporting the Cyprus issue, although of course nothing's happening about the Cyprus issue, but it's still there. Expressing its views. What's interesting is in 1988, when Michael Dukakis is the Democratic candidate for president of the United States, he's the keynote speaker at AHEPA's 65th Supreme Convention, which takes place in Miami in August of 1988. Very cleverly, Dukakis's opponent, George Bush Sr., included AHEPA in a very important speech he made during that electoral campaign. He talked about something he described as 1,000 points of light, which was generated by the many ways that Americans did very good volunteer work, and he included AHEPA as one of the 1,000 points of light in America. And truth be said, many Greek Americans did support George Bush, and AHEPA officially supported Dukakis, but of course, several leading AHEPA members voted for Bush because of their allegiance with the Republican Party. The 1990s was a moment of crisis. There's an embezzlement scandal. Any organization, the Archdiocese had equivalent scandal with some real estate. You know, when organizations become big and they become wealthy, it's somewhat inevitable that will happen. But what the interesting thing is that AHEPA was almost threatened. Its existence was threatened by this huge by this huge problem of the embezzlement in the 1990s. But the election of Spiro Makris, a very able president, refocused AHEPA on the issues of Hellenism. That was the first thing they did. And the second thing they did is they went back to their anti-racist past and spoke about being formed to defend themselves against the Ku Klux Klan, something very interestingly that they had not really mentioned since the 1920s. They had somehow forgotten it because they were now, I think because they were part of the American mainstream, they didn't want to kind of remember the difficult days of the past, the way many Greek Americans. I'm interested now in writing about the Greeks in diner restaurants, and many Americans tell me, "Oh, that was the era we were washing dishes. We don't want to go back to that." There's an embarrassment by many Greek Americans about the humble roots, but they brought forward the discrimination and the racist past. And Greek American Senator Sarbanes made a statement in 1997 at the Congress, describing AHEPA as an anti-racist organization, and going back to those roots gave AHEPA a new lease of life. And that brings us to the 21st century and the final slides in my presentation. AHEPA is successful because it addresses the many interests of many Greek Americans. And they do stress the national issues of Greece and Hellenism. But as you can see here, this is from an interview given by Basil Mosaidis, the current executive secretary. He talks about AHEPA needing to step up and protect and promote Hellenism, bridge the gap between the second and fourth generation Greek Americans, work for justice of Cyprus, promote the Athens Olympics, protect the Greek Orthodox Church, strengthen the AHEPA by other issues such as working on issues of anemia, autism in Greece, bone marrow registry, and even the campaign to return the Parthenon marbles to Greece. So by the 21st century, AHEPA is a kind of broad gamut organization that addresses very many interests, and does so, and that's why it kind of retains its membership, because some people focus on the international issues, some people focus on the domestic issues, and so on and so forth. Here, an example of the many things they do. They have senior citizens living quarters that they finance, a very successful and wealthy program. They were active during the COVID era because they did food pantries and other stuff. They have kind of random events such as welcoming basketball player Giannis Antetokounmpo to America, and they engage in Journey to Greece programs, sending young Greek Americans to Greece to reconnect with their roots. So broad gamut of activities. The focus is on international issues. They have a Capitol Hill day in which they go up to the Congress and meet senators and congressmen and tell them about Greece's issues and national issues. They honor congressmen. This is Congressman John Lewis, who marched with Archbishop Iakovos in 1965 in Selma, Alabama, and AHEPA honored John Lewis on an anniversary of that event. I should say that in 1965, when Archbishop Iakovos marched with the Dr. Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama, AHEPA made no statement of support at that time. But in retrospect, they see the value of that honored John Lewis. So it's a range of things they do in Washington and on Capitol Hill. They have very, very close relations with the Greek Orthodox Church. I spoke about the 1920s and 1930s when the relationships were somewhat subterranean. Now it's very, very public. This is the current Archbishop Elpidophoros. AHEPA was visiting in Constantinople, Istanbul, when Elpidophoros was appointed. So they had a photo op with them, the first Greek-American organization with which Elpidophoros met. They presented him a check for the building of the St. Nicholas Church at the bottom of the Twin Towers. AHEPA, the Archdiocese, and especially Archbishop Elpidophoros are very, very close. They have very, very close relationship. In 2021, they had their convention in Athens. I should say this was the only Greek-American organization that had the courage, the guts to hold a convention in Athens during COVID. No other organization did so. Even the one I belong to, the Modern Greek Studies Association, did not hold a convention in Athens. This was the 100th anniversary of the Greek Revolution, and I felt all Greek-American organizations should have honored that occasion by holding meetings in Athens. It was only AHEPA who did that. And they received red carpet treatment, and this is a photograph on the right from a visit of Mitsotakis the following year in Washington, D.C., where he gave a special award. That's AHEPA President former AHEPA President Jimmy Kokotas receiving this award from Mitsotakis. So very close relationships with the Archdiocese, close relationships with Greece, close relationship with the Greek government. And finally, AHEPA continues in this vein. It does all these other activities I mentioned, but the foreign policy issues are primary. They're involved in these meetings between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, which have to do with foreign policy issues in the Eastern Mediterranean. And very, very significant this summer, because their new president is a Greek Cypriot, Savas Tsivikos, AHEPA is holding its Supreme Convention for the first time in its history in Cyprus on the 50th anniversary of the invasion. And that is a very significant event. Maybe a lot of people could argue that a lot of what AHEPA internationally does is symbolic, but that it shows you the way that it is in some way concerned with the issues of Greece and manages to combine Americanism with Hellenism. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions on all of what I've done or other issues connected to AHEPA. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor Kitroeff, for that very fascinating sort of presentation. I've actually got quite a few questions. As far as I know, AHEPA is a men-only or male-only organization. Has that ever been challenged?
So I was thinking of challenging it in a sense. I've read through that organization, and it seems to me they have a women's section, the Daughters of Penelope. I didn't mention these other sections hoping that I'd get the questions, because I didn't want to just put one slide on the women. It would be tokenism. And they also have youth organizations, the Sons of Pericles and the Daughters of Athena. The Daughters of Penelope, I tell you what I did. In 2022, they had their convention, their centenary convention in Las Vegas, and the Daughters of Penelope had their convention as well. So I informally interviewed some members of the Daughters of Penelope, and I also attended part of their conference that was taking place at the same time in the same hotel. And it seemed to me that the Daughters of Penelope were perfectly happy to have their own organization. They seem to be having much more fun. The Daughters of Penelope sessions seemed to be much more lively. They had interesting topics. And the women I spoke to said, it's a historic thing that we are separated into men and women, and we are perfectly happy to operate as we do separately. Now, AHEPA is really aware of the fact that it sounds so outdated. That's why they now talk about something called the AHEPA family, and the AHEPA family is AHEPA Daughters of Penelope and the two youth organizations. So it does sound a bit traditional. But what I return to what was more striking, the striking thing was that the women's organization itself seems to be happy to operate on its own.
Um, before this seminar, what I did is went on AHEPA's website and looked at their constitution, because we here at the Greek Community of Melbourne, we're in the process of reviewing our constitution. It's probably sort of 50, 60 years old. It's quite outdated. And I noticed there one of the clauses, and my question is, can AHEPA be considered a secular organization when one of the clauses is they have to believe in God or Jesus Christ or something like that? I mean, why the need for that if you consider yourself a secular organization?
Indeed. Of course, that clause is part of their history, because part of the way that they're trying to persuade the Ku Klux Klan, the xenophobes, the racists back in the 1920s, they promote their Christian character. So they put belief in God, which is very, it's a very important aspect of the way that that the United States defines itself. Religion culturally is very important in the United States. So that's why AHEPA does that. And in fact, they don't talk so much about Greek Orthodoxy, but they talk about their belief in God, and they continue that belief in God. And maybe it's not. I wouldn't describe it 100% as a secular organization. I think one would call it a secular organization only to distinguish it from the Archdiocese, which is basically the church. So maybe it's a secular organization with very, very strong religious aspects. And more recently, it's coming very close to the Archdiocese. It's come close to recently in Athens, they had the archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which is an organization of persons supporting the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. AHEPA was involved. Many leading AHEPans are archons. So there seems to be some kind of fusion of all these Greek American organizations.
Yeah. And also in the last few years, there have been movements like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. Has AHEPA issued statement on those movements if there's been that repivot to combating racism and prejudices in society?
AHEPA has been very slow to do that. It did honor, as I said, Congressman John Lewis. That was one of the very few examples of, in a sense, expressing views of current American social issues. The Archdiocese was more open. Archbishop Elpidophoros participated in a march in Brooklyn. So, in a sense, I would say AHEPA is very careful not to express itself in those issues for fear of arriving at any political partisan positions. AHEPA is very careful with politics, and to their credit, although let's say politically AHEPA would be not sympathetic to former Prime Minister Tsipras, when Alexis Tsipras, as Prime Minister, visited Athens, visited the Washington, D.C., and when AHEPA visited Athens, they met, they issued statements, etc.
Okay. And something I'm not quite sure, based on the Constitution, to be a member, do you have to show Greek ancestry, or is it enough to be a Phil or something? Because I've also noticed some presidents have been made AHEPAs as well. So what's actually the situation when it comes to membership criteria and background?
Well, that's a huge issue in the United States because of mixed marriages, of people considering themselves Philhellenes. So in some ways, this is becoming of having Greek heritage is almost redundant, and there are even some Greek Americans who describe themselves as Philhellenes. So AHEPA, I'm not sure I haven't got the Constitution in front of me now, but AHEPA is open to people of non-Greek heritage.
And I'm glad you brought up the issue of the adopted children, because quite timely, in 2 weeks' time, we've got Gondovan speaking at the seminar series as well. So it's quite timely. Okay. I don't think there are any other questions that have come through. So they're usually not a shy lot, but anyway, I think I've sort of covered my questions. Look, if there's nothing we've got to add, Professor Kitroeff, thanks once again. I'm looking forward to your new book on American diners. I mean, we've got a similar experience here with cafes and fish and chip shop as well. So it'd be interesting to sort of see the some of the similarities and differences as well. When's that due?
Oh, I haven't started writing yet, so it'll be a
Okay.
couple of years down. Yes,
Okay.
but yes, I'm aware of of what is the existence in Australia, and these are wonderful ways that one kind of, researching the one side and researching the other, then someone can come along and make that connection.
Well, and the Australian Cafes book has also got a US connection as well, because a lot of those migrants traveled to the States and got some of the ideas and implemented them in Australia as well. So,
Wonderful.
yeah, okay. Thanks once again, and hope to see everyone at next week's seminar on the Greek diaspora of France.